I'll get started with my introduction and people can still keep joining in. So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our sixth Fish Sounds Educate Seminar. And for today, we'll be hearing from Dr. Kieran Cox, a postdoctoral fellow at Simon Fraser University. Before I hand it over, please note that this seminar is being recorded for the Fish Sounds YouTube channel and that there should hopefully be time for questions at the end. So with that, please take it away, Kieran.
Thanks, Audrey. Okay, so as Audrey mentioned, I'm Kieran, and I'm a postdoc at Simon Fraser University. And today I'm going to be talking about some of our work on underwater noise. Most of the work I'll be talking about today has been conducted in the Huu-ay-aht, Snoqualmie, Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam nations unceded territory. And I'm very grateful to these nations for their stewardship of this land. I'm also incredibly grateful to this group of folks, and many others really, who make the work that we do possible and also a lot of fun. So how do species navigate a kelp forest, right? How do they communicate with their conspecifics, find their prey, and avoid their predators? These are really broad and long-standing questions in ecology, and they're really what got me interested in this system to begin with. And are similar mechanisms at play on this coral reef 1,200 kilometers away. Well, if we consider a representative individual, say this black rockfish, which is, just off the coast of where I'm living right now, we know that it has visual, olfactory, and listening spaces that allow it to determine the distances at which a signal can be detected. Now, these are going to vary a lot by the taxa and the specifics of the condition, but we can generally assume that the listening space is going to span further than olfactory and visual cues. And this is primarily due to the way that water moves chemical cues and light's limitations within water. And we know that fishes are able to detect this information through several structures, one of which is the otolith, which is really analogous to a human ear. And, we know that they don't need external ears because of the relatively consistency between tissue and water. This allows sound to travel to the inner ear without the aid of an external structure. Many fishes also possess secondary hearing mechanisms, which in this case include something like the Weberian apparatus, which is a series of 4 bones that connects the inner ear to the swim bladder. And this basically acts as a transducer that increases the fish's ability to hear sound. Many fish also have one or several lateral lines, which primarily detect particle motion, but they're actually quite similar to the sensory systems that are found in the inner ear. So this is really great for detecting particle motion in the near field. Now, these hearing abilities have evolved to detect a wide range of underwater sounds. But unfortunately, the ocean doesn't sound like it once did. Sources such as sonar, boats, pile driving have become much more pervasive. And really, this poses the question as a conservation biologist, what are the implications of this sound for these fish species? And if we examine this using a meta-analysis, which allows us to consider a wide range of species and experimental conditions, we can plot the response category along the x-axis and the magnitude of the response along the y. And this means that if the data falls below this line, it indicates there's a decrease, and above the line, there's an increase. Along the line, no change. When we do this, we see that fish exposed to anthropogenic noise are going to forage less often. They're going to spend more time moving around, especially engaging in startle responses, and they have an increased cost of reproduction, which, as many of us know, is already the most costly thing you can do biologically. And these responses are going to register also physiologically. They're going to have an increased hearing threshold, indicating they become temporarily deaf to certain frequencies or decibels. And they're going to have raised blood cortisol, which is their primary stress hormone. We also have some very preliminary data that we're going to work to publish soon, which indicates that species with secondary hearing mechanisms so the Weberian apparatus that I mentioned earlier, have the ability to basically change or are more susceptible to certain sounds. So they have an increased response to anthropogenic noise. They're better able to detect biological sounds and somewhat more so able to distinguish between tones. And so this means that, not all hearing is equal, but fish are certainly affected by underwater sound. Now, including invertebrates in this dialogue is something we've been thinking about a lot recently, and it's really an essential part of it. As we know, they're living in a noisy world as well. Again, using a meta-analysis, which actually got published a couple of weeks ago, was led by Haley Davies at the University of Victoria, we determined that synthetic sounds, so those generated by computers, negatively influence invertebrate behavior and physiology. Natural sounds, including those produced by fish, and music, which is kind of an emerging topic within aquaculture, slightly increase fish responses or have a positive effect, you could say, given the directionality of this data. But the response to anthropogenic noise, I think, is probably the most interesting part of this data, which is that yes, it has a negative impact on both their behavior and their physiology, but more so their physiology. Now, we could expect this to be the case potentially if physiological responses precede behavioral ones, or their response is more severe in terms of the metric that you're measuring. But when we look into this type of trend in more detail, what we see is that anthropogenic noise increases things like recruitment. And, this is really the case because invertebrates are drawn to this as a settling cue. And this can occur despite the fact that the environment they're being called towards, once they've entered it, is going to have a negative impact on their ability to defend against predators and their movements. There's going to be a suite of physiological responses as well, so most notably impacts to their genetics, biochemistry, and morphology. We see this really time and time again when we look at it experimentally. For example, in this case, if you go out and you collect Hemigrapsis crabs, which is a little shore crab on this coast, and you take them from environments that can be classified as kind of high or low noise conditions, you put them in an experimental tank, play back vessel noise collected from the area, and then you see how they respond to a simulated predator attack. So when we do this, we see that, yes, certainly there's an implications for their movement, shown here with the bar graphs being higher. So initially, they're more likely to move than they are freeze under a noisy condition. However, there's not a lot of difference from the sites. So if you come from a high noise or a low noise environment, this basically indicates that they don't develop much of a tolerance based on these living conditions and kind of respond very much at the time. And this is consistent across, the many sites that we looked at in this case. And if we compare this to all existing data you can find on marine arthropods' responses to noise, we see that it falls well within the range of what's expected. I really think this is the kind of neat but also challenging aspect of thinking about invertebrates in this regard, as there's so many different mechanisms by which they're perceiving sound and types of response. And, underwater sound, in this case from an anthropogenic source, can be a cue for many of these things. Now, the real take home there is that like it's sound specific, right? It's going to be a function of how much, what frequency, source, excuse me, these types of things. And this has been a really emerging question on the coast for the last couple of years. And we've been trying to dive right into it. So we've been developing a pretty comprehensive picture of what the coast soundscape is like. And we're trying to take a minimum, average, and maximum approach to this so we can try to estimate kind of ranges. Specifically, we've just wrapped up 2 years of noise modeling, again, aiming for minimum, maximum, and average sound pressure levels. And when doing so, we considered 14 vessel classes and wind and wave noise, 6 frequency bands, and 3 depths. We've done this for British Columbia's exclusive economic zone, so the coast out, and 8 focal regions at a higher resolution, so 200 by 200 meters. And these are really areas we think that this is going to play out in a very big way as far as a discussion from a policy standpoint. And the point here with the different resolutions, the larger map is about 2 by 2 kilometers, and the smaller ones are 2 by 200. That's a computational issue. These models take years to run. So when we look at noise pollution levels on the coast, thinking about the minimum, so this is wind and wave noise, and you can kind of think about this as what the coast would have sounded like before the Industrial Revolution. This is broadband noise, 10-meter depth. We see there's about an average sound pressure level of 75 decibels. When we consider average sound levels from all vessels on the coast, same depth and broadband noise, see that this increases to about 120 decibels, with many parts exceeding 150. And when we consider maximum sound pressure levels, so the loudest that any given cell experiences, we see that 150 to 175 decibels are quite common. And so the difference in this case between minimum and maximum is well over 50 decibels for the entire coast, with obviously many areas exceeding that considerably. And so for context, the number that I think really sticks out for me here is 50 decibels is about the difference between a typewriter and a rock concert. So the coast has changed a lot from a soundscape perspective in relatively recent decades. And we can use this data to try to get some biological insight into what it means. And this is some work that we've started a little bit more recently, which is specifically thinking about things like the Pacific herring. One of the reasons we're thinking about this species, among others, is that we have dose response data for how it's influenced by sound. So this is kind of a classic way to think about a pollutant, basically where you're thinking in terms of 50 and 90% response rates. And so in this case, we're seeing that around 123 decibels, you're getting a 50% adverse response rate for the Pacific herring. Now, when we can use this and apply it to the maps that we've made to basically set a threshold and say, okay, where are we seeing above 123 decibels? And, in this case, if we think about the minimum levels, not very common, right? So actually not occurring at all under these conditions. If we think about average conditions, then all of a sudden you see the regions where this species is more likely to be influenced by anthropogenic noise levels. And this becomes obviously more so the case when we think about the maximum noise conditions. And, this is an example within Pacific herring and something we're diving into in more detail now, but we also have similar data for killer whales and salmon. And this basically allows us to think in terms of dose response curves for a fairly simplistic, but very important food web on the coast, which is herring, salmon, killer whales. And the work we're doing right now is mapping where these 50 and when possible 90% response rates are likely to occur. And we're going to be able to estimate this for the coast, also within specific regions. And then through that, we can identify the primary polluters, if you will, or sources of this noise as we have those varying vessel classes. And this work is being supported by the CDOC Society and the Salish Sea Institute. So I just thought I'd mention that as I'm very grateful to them and for their generous support. So, I think this kind of thinking is really important. It's kind of how we take the numbers we throw around in terms of ocean noise and we translate it into biologically more meaningful metrics, especially when we think about conservation. But it's going to take quite a bit of time before this kind of thinking can be fleshed out in detail. And this is an emerging topic right now. So, we always want to be thinking about what we can do today to kind of move the needle on this conservation issue, so to speak. And in this regard, we've really focused on 3 main topics, which are habitat conservation, education, and then also regulations. And so I'm going to touch briefly on our work on all of these. Well, habitat conservation is, really an important one for me as I'm not actually really an acoustician. I'm primarily a diver, marine ecologist. I got into the field this way. And a couple of years ago, I was sitting on a kelp forest and I became aware of that kind of same stillness that most people associate with terrestrial forests. Right. In many regards, actually, I think this is the reason why people like these ecosystems. It's really common to say, oh, it helps me think, it clears my head. You become aware of this the more you go into these systems and the further you go into them. And I realized, what I was perceiving as I sat there kind of bubbling away on this kelp forest was the conservation of the soundscape. And that this service is likely a function of, tree in this photo, but kelp in the case that I was thinking about, density, area, and composition. And unfortunately, the elephant in the room here is that these habitats are degrading. And if this is going to go on, this service is going to decline. And so we think that the process looks something like this, where a healthy kelp forest will block vessel noise and conserve the species' listening and communication spaces, shown here around a copper rockfish as a circle. And as the kelp forest degrades, more noise pollution will enter the habitat. And this will be the case even if noise pollution is constant, right? So the species is actually perceiving a higher level of the pollutant, despite the fact of being constant from the source. So we think the theoretical relationship looks something like this, where habitat degradation increases noise propagation, and certain habitats, depending on their structure and their composition, will increase or decrease the slope of this relationship. So really complex, structurally dense, loaded with gas bubbles, kelp forest maybe is going to decrease the slope of that relationship. A seagrass meadow nearby, less structural complexity, different physical composition, maybe it's going to increase that. But in either case, there will be an inverse relationship that likely exists where listening space and habitat degradation follow basically the mirror of that relationship. And so, when I say habitat degradation, I think it's important to point out that this can be through many sources, right? So this can be acoustically mediated. This can be noise pollution gets introduced into a system and it causes the habitat decline. Big one on any coast, I would say, is certainly climate change, but also just modifications to the habitat in general. These result in habitat degradation. And the point here is that when that happens, then a feedback loop emerges, right? And so you have more noise pollution coming into the system. This has implications for various characteristics of the soundscape. So acoustic refugia decline, you have reduced attenuation, and you have an increased distance that noise is going to be traveling. This has implications for the biological community, which then, once this feedback loop starts, basically is going to continue to degrade the system, right? Because you've started this, and so your community declines. That's going to cause more noise pollution to enter the system, and so on. The kind of take home here is what that means is that you can have what we've kind of determined to, at least we've coined it currently as stable acoustic states, right? Where you have a system and it goes through a degradation pathway and it's likely hit some sort of tipping point and declines quite rapidly. And so if this is the case, two extremes of it would be healthy and degraded acoustic states. And these would be really diagnosable based on the soundscape. And the key point here is just that, we want to think about this in terms of how you can detect it, how it could recover, and how it will change. This is all great. Theory is really fun to explore. And this was a really fun exercise to think about in more detail. But, fundamentally, we're community ecologists. And so you want to test it. And so we've been doing exactly that over the last few years. For the first 6 months of my postdoc, I lived in Banfield at a marine station there. And we conducted this work within kelp forests. And then headed to Belize, to the Smithsonian, to the salmon coral reefs and seagrasses. And there's certainly two folks, one of which is certainly here today, the other one maybe as well, who need a special shout out for this work. which is Audrey. She joined and is leading the seagrass and the coral reef work. And this was started as a PhD student and is now a big part of her postdoc at the University of Victoria. And then Lim from the Cote Lab that I'm a member of joined for all of this work. So two really great folks to spend a month on a very small island with. So in each system, the method is relatively similar. So I'm just going to go through one of them in detail. But the idea is a pair of divers are hopping in the water. You're going to survey the biological community. And in the case of, certainly in the kelp forest case, this is done with the reef life survey method. You're measuring the habitat characteristics, so kelp height, kelp density, kelp area, kelp biomass. You're then deploying a set of hydrophones, one on the outside of the forest, one on the other side of the forest, about 5 meters apart or at 5 meters apart. Putting in a set of GoPros so we can record species responses in the ecosystem. Then we're introducing noise pollution from a boat and from a playback, which allows us to introduce specific frequencies. And we're conducting this work across a range of habitat conditions, right? So trying to think about that kind of degradation, effectively quantifying this relationship. And so our analyses of this work is ongoing, but Audrey's been making really great headway on the seagrass topic. So I have a little bit of data to share today, which is really exciting, which is specifically that there certainly does seem to be the case. And so there's a positive correlation between the density of a seagrass system and the amount of transmission loss that noise pollution experiences. Specifically, it's about 4 decibels within the range of seagrasses we looked at. Now, we have to still get through a little bit of the data to figure out the biological implications of this. And so in the interim, we can pull from the literature, right? Because we kind of want to know, what does 4 decibels actually mean? Well, if you consider something like the Gulf toadfish, which is a species Audrey's worked a lot on and occurs in pretty close proximity to a part of this work that was done certainly in Florida, for a 7 to 9 increase in noise level, 7 to 9 decibel increase in noise exposure, you see a 4 to 5-fold increase in their cortisol. So that's their main stress hormone, relatively small change in noise conditions, but a fairly large change in stress levels. And so, we think this is likely the case that this 4 decibel transmission loss is going to have an influence on the species in the system. And, our kind of early analysis of kelp forests and coral reefs are indicating it's the same here. But again, the structural characteristics of the system are going to change that amount quite a bit. So, that's our contribution to habitat conservation currently on this topic. And I think regulation is something that I continually come back to as I think more about noise pollution. It's not something as a, kind of ecologist I've thought a lot about initially, but it seems to all be pointing in this direction. And so the big document here, at least from a Canadian perspective, is the Ocean Noise Strategy, which the draft has been released. And we're going to, the government's working towards finalizing right now. So, maybe this is it. No work needs to be done and we're all going to be fine. But, if you read this and the surrounding policies, you certainly notice kind of a glaring theme, which is just that environmental contaminants, so we're thinking about noise from a pollution perspective, are those that cause harm, right? But then a substance is one that is distinguishable organic, inorganic matter, right? And these are by our Environmental Protection Act. And as a result, because noise is not organic or inorganic, it's currently not considered to be a pollutant or a contaminant in Canada. And this has quite a lot of this is a fairly large effect when we think in terms of the policy perspective, also how we can allocate funding to it, and the kind of regulatory teeth these documents can have. But one thing when I was going through this that I did note and I was pretty excited about was this statement, right? The Species at Risk Act document is going to identify threats which include noise, or does identify threats which include noise, and there's actions to accompany the recovery and the conservation of species in Canada. So, I read that and I was like, oh, this is a really kind of exciting approach here, right? We're going to take a species-specific approach to conserving marine soundscapes. And so, oh, sorry. And so we can look at this though, right? We can say, okay, in Canada, COSEWIC assesses species to determine if they should be considered for listing. And then SARA, which is the Species at Risk Act, is determined by the Canadian government. And this is a kind of process where COSEWIC puts forth an assessment of a species, SARA considers it, and it is listed or not. And so Kiara Cattler, who's now at the University of Alberta, when she was in the Cote lab, went through every document from both of these that we could find on fish in Canada. And when doing so, the key metrics we were thinking about is the state of the soundscape, if production by the fish is listed, the number of anthropogenic stressors that are considered, and if noise pollution is among those. So kind of taking a fish and soundscape approach to how we're conserving species in Canada. And when you do this, you see that COSEWIC is putting forth, reasonable number of fishes, certainly 138, and a portion of those are ultimately being listed under SARA. We were able to use the fish sounds data to determine that 32 of the species that COSEWIC has assessed and 3 of those that SARA have listed are actively soniferous. But unfortunately, mentions of the soundscape or their sound production are largely not occurring in these documents. Now, these species span 11 families, but they are predominantly rockfish, like the one I mentioned on our coast, as they're known to be soniferous. But there's quite a wide range of species in Canada that are soniferous and are considered within these documents. And we can pull this all together to consider kind of all of it in one go, which is the idea that, okay, a species gets put forth by COSEWIC, and then it could ultimately be listed or not by SARA. And these are all the soniferous species, by the way. Now, to what extent is their soundscape considered? How about their sound production? We know that anthropogenic stressors are going to be considered, and this is a big part of why they're at risk to begin with. And is noise pollution considered within that? And so, in some regards, this paints kind of a dire picture, I could say, but I actually find it incredibly motivating and helpful, right? Because this, if all dark blue, indicates that we are acknowledging that these species are using sound to communicate. Their soundscape is an important aspect of their habitat, and the aim is to conserve and restore habitat for them, and that noise pollution can pose a threat to them. And so certainly, yes, there's not many examples of when this is done in all cases, but I really do see this as a roadmap forwards. And I hope it's something that can be applied to other countries as well. I'm less aware of kind of the international and national routes that every country is taking to thinking about their species, but I think it's probably similar in some regards to this. And so, yeah, that's, kind of a big part of our current regulation thinking is that species specific approach. But, as you all know, coming to Fish Sounds Talk, we're also quite big on education, as we see it as quite an exciting part of the work that we do. And so this has been, I would say, our major push in the education space in the last couple of years, which is Fish Sounds Educate. And so we launched this. And actually, this was funded by Fisheries and Oceans Canada, which I think is a really important point to make here, right? We proposed a grant that said, instead of, tracking, ocean data on this topic or conserving these systems, we will support Canada's commitment to ocean conservation targets by engaging with Canadians, right? And increasing ocean literacy, promoting and inspiring ocean conservation, and then also hopefully developing a method by which scientists can make their work more accessible. As we continue to do this work, we become very aware that there's a large disconnect between the scientific thinking on a topic and what scientists are aware of, and the public's awareness of even how that process occurs, but certainly where the knowledge is. And so this has worked really well and also been a lot of fun. So we've been able to join many outreach events and host many of our own over the last couple of years. And yeah, for folks paying a lot of attention, that is a game called Fish or Fart, which we thought would do well with kids and school age children, but the reality is I think many people enjoy it. And it's actually a really fun way to kind of break the ice, right? You can say, yep, herring fart. This is a very funny aspect of their behavior. But also now let's talk about ocean soundscapes, underwater sound, physics, science, conservation, and these type of topics. We've been able to meet folks and actually had really good uptake from this. So we've been able to connect with lifelong learners, naturalist groups. Many people are keen to do this. And a little bit more recently, we put together a coloring book that we just sent to the printers, which is really exciting. So if folks are interested in this, please send us your information, and we'll do our best to make sure you get a copy very soon. And so as I mentioned, the uptake on this has been pretty incredible. We've had 71 outreach events that we've either held or attended, and these have ranged a lot. We've definitely seen that high school groups and middle school groups are very keen to have people come in and talk to them. And this has been kind of a process of emailing many people, but then word of mouth. Yeah, we find we get contacted every couple of weeks now at this point to to join or host an event. But then really, yeah, a whole range of people. And, as a result, we've now been able to interact with over 3,000 participants. And when we initially put this together, we wrote on the grant, I think the number was 400 that we thought was kind of like an ambitious target that we would be able to connect with. And, clearly we are wrong about that, right? Like society is very keen to talk to scientists. Teachers love the idea of having experts come in. And I think having people come in who are doing this work in the field, are right there at the front of the research, really provides these people with a great resource for this type of topic. And in terms of the model that we're thinking about now when we go and do this type of work is basically that, this kind of classic approach to the scientific method is one that can exist largely in isolation, right? So we can do this in the ivory halls of academia, or we can open it up a little bit and have a process by which, there is really the onus on the scientist to inform and engage with society. And we think this is kind of a two-way street, right? So certainly, yes, it's great for us to get our information out there, but it's also where we can gain a lot of insight, right? People provide us with all types of ideas. Many of the people we talk to spend far more time in these ecosystems than we do. And it's been really informative. So this is now, I would say, a big part of how we're doing all of our research. Okay, so that was quite a bit. And yeah, I just wanted to leave with a couple of summary points as I think, yeah, there's a lot of exciting work on this topic, but ultimately I think the take homes are fairly straightforward, right? Which is that, coastal noise levels have changed a lot in recent decades, certainly over 50 decibels. And this varies a lot depending on your source and your location. This does have a negative influence on species, specifically thinking about fish and invertebrates in this context, and their ability to navigate their environment. And habitat loss is likely exacerbating a lot of these impacts. And really, there's many routes forwards, but I think that, education, habitat protection, and regulation work in combination to address this issue, and we kind of need to move on all of them at once. So again, I'd like to thank everybody that makes the work that we do possible, especially those who spent 215 days with me at remote field stations during the start of my postdoc, the funders who generously support the work that we do, those who steward the lands that we live, work, and play. I'll take any questions.
Yay. Thank you so much, Kieran, for that awesome presentation. You certainly covered a wide breadth of work, as many of our speakers have in previous talks, and it's always fun to get such a wide overview. At least I think so. So at this point, we do have time for questions. You're welcome to either unmute yourself or raise your hand. I'm trying to make it so I can see people, or you can send them in the chat. Are you talking, Kieran?
Nope, I'm not. I put in a cough candy. I've got a cold.
Oh, sure. Sorry, I saw mouth movements and got worried. Um, so maybe the to start us off, oh, we have a question. What decibel metric do you use for analyzing soundscapes?
What decibel metric?
Yes.
Like what?
So perhaps
Oh,
like sound
Amy. Oh,
pressure
cool.
levels versus
Amy, sorry. What's in this? Is this in relation for the noise mapping,
mm,
or is
root.
this?
Sorry, I should just talk. It's easier just to talk. I was just wondering when you were talking about like the 50 decibel difference that you've been seeing over time and stuff. I was just curious what metrics, is it
Uh,
a root mean squared? Is it averaged over a day? Or if you could just give a little bit
Yeah,
more
yeah, yeah,
information.
definitely. Yeah. So for the noise maps, and this is where I'm a bit cautious when talking about the maximum, you might have noticed. So the average and minimum are root mean squared, and so they're averaged over that data is averaged over the course of the month. Like the way that modeling was done is it's got two time points in it, July and January, and it's averaged over the month, and then the peak is yeah, kind of a unique number, so we'll release it a little bit more cautiously, in that it's the highest noise levels a cell exceeds, a cell experiences. So it is yeah, so that's a peak value.
Thank you. That's helpful. And thanks for the talk. Very interesting.
Thank you. While maybe some people are thinking of questions, I was wondering, um, I participated in some of the outreach events we did, but I'm curious what your experience talking with other folks and things like that is sort of what some of the public or students' view on noise pollution is, and also the topic of fish sounds and things like that. I always find it interesting to hear different people's responses. I was curious if you had any insights from that.
Yeah, I do. You know what? I think kids these days are so aware of environmental issues. And I think that's really exciting and it's very motivating. Yeah, it's all around them, right? They get it on their social media feeds, it's on TikTok. Um, I think that's where I really enjoy Fish Sounds because it kind of pairs the two. I think just going into a classroom constantly to speak about climate change, economic despair, these kind of things is really tough. We know that, there's fatigue surrounding those issues. We know that people can become very overwhelmed by them. And I think the pairing of the two is really nice because most of us did not become biologists purely based on the idea that, the environment is being impacted in a negative way. We got excited initially about yeah, the hums of a midshipman or the farts of a herring or just underwater sounds of parrotfish munching away. And I think that's where it's really exciting. You see those kind of differences. One I have become more recently aware of, and I think this is going to really influence how I think about regulation, is just the implications of saying noise pollution because then people assume pollution, contaminant, regulation, they assume these things exist. And I think that's been kind of interesting as I've talked more with naturalist clubs about the ocean noise strategy. They're obviously very focused on killer whales. The American government, admittedly, is quite a bit further, I would say, on this topic than the Canadian one is. And so I think kind of clarifying that for people has been something I'm going to focus on a lot more in the future. Because, yeah, I think that's where you can get a base of people that are very motivated to have these discussions and taking people to task. Some of those naturalist clubs are just phenomenally educated and they are very motivated and very active. And so I think having them aware specifically of where these things live from a policy perspective is really important.
Yeah, thanks for that. And yeah, one fun one I always hear a lot is from fishers, like, how can I use sounds to catch more fish? And so the responses can certainly vary, but I think that's great insights too.
Yeah, the dinner
We
bell
have
one is really funny. Like, can we
exactly.
draw them into an area? And I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, there's some applications there certainly.
There's sort of an education space there, though, because informing them that like just making less noise will increase the amount of fish in the area, and therefore your odds is still addressing the problem.
Mhm.
Yeah, certainly, certainly. And I think this is what's neat about invertebrates, right? Like they settle to noisy docks and pilings, and that's why you get, in some regard, that's why you get a lot of mussel beds in those areas. And so, yeah, there's a great paper by Chelsea Rockman on microplastic pollution that's effectively called something like a plastic isn't a plastic isn't a plastic. And I'm very keen to see something developed, or I think we'll probably develop it soon on noise pollution because it's really this kind of nuance. Let's be very specific about, the amount, the type, these kind of things. And I think that can kind of get lost sometimes, which is actually a great question or segue to the next question, which is impacts of sound quality, so low versus high. Is this in relation to the habitat work we're doing or just kind of more broadly? I'll answer it
Not,
either way.
yeah.
Yeah, so this is something we've been thinking about in relation to um, I haven't personally, but I mean, yeah, my work within the kelp stuff is just ongoing right now. Audrey's been thinking about this more from a seagrass perspective with specific tones and specific decibels within that. So, yeah, that work is, I'm starting that analysis right now. So, kind of yeah, I'll be able to have more details on the specifics of that soon.
If I could hop in, we do tend to focus more on chronic or broadband or like not necessarily high impact sounds. Like for people who might not be familiar, you can think of a jackhammer versus like a hum of an engine motor. And so all of our habitat work, while we focused in on different tones and things like that, they were not necessarily what you would consider like high impact in that sense. But it's certainly a very big topic in the field and can lead to increased impacts or effects if it is a more impactful sound in general. Um, there was another question from Claire. When you think of effective policy measures to mitigate increasingly loud oceans, what comes to mind first? How does enforcement take place?
It's a great question. I'm pretty honest about this one. I am not envious of the task that Fisheries and Oceans Canada has for developing a noise strategy. I think it's a very challenging thing to do when we don't know kind of the full extent of where a pollutant is, who's creating it, the biological implications of it. I think this is a very tough thing to do. So I understand the need to kind of move through it systematically. I think that's why, for me personally, I think a species specific approach is very valuable because you can say this species is sensitive in this way and this species lives in this area. This is what we've done kind of largely with killer whales. That's had a really positive influence on the dialogue and created policy in Canada that folks can point to. Setting thresholds is certainly, I think, the kind of overarching aim there. But enforcing thresholds is a different discussion. So yeah, I think for me right now, I'm very keen to lean into species specific thinking, try to map out basically what certain thresholds will mean for the coast and so where they would be. And that allows us to say these areas are really relevant from a threshold perspective. Um, and then the big one, and this is just a side, I really do want to see I want to see noise moved into kind of a contaminant space in Canada. And this is part of our ability to get funding on this topic. I think that's very important. I understand why it's not going in that direction. I did recently find, I think it might be the Environmental Protection Act or a different act. There's an indication basically about energy as a pollutant. And I've been thinking a lot more about noise. Sound is just vibrational energy. So I've been thinking more about that kind of space, and these kind of energy-based pollutants. So yeah, I think that's kind of a long answer, but it's a complicated question. So for me, it's certainly species specific approach, thinking, understanding what thresholds will mean and where we should prioritize. And then I think there's a really big push to get a better funding landscape in Canada. It's been good recently, like Fisheries and Ocean Canada has been doing a lot of work on this, but I think having access to that kind of contaminants-based funding and thinking is going to be really important.
We had a couple of related comments in the chat too. So one said, I think more studies are needed to consider sound pressure, particle motion, and vibration components of anthropogenic sound, and that this would help look at some of those more community level or varied species effects. So I don't know if you want to touch on that a bit more.
I completely agree. Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly true. And the field's been moving in this direction for a long time. It's, part of it is a cost and technology issue. But I think some of those barriers are changing. And so, yeah, this is where the field's undeniably going to go. And I think you're absolutely right. It's where we can get to the real nuance of what noise is as a stressor and why it's stressful for certain species. And if we're thinking about invertebrates, definitely that dialogue will be greatly improved when thinking about things like particle motion, just based on the way they perceive sound.
There was another comment too where someone was worked on a TED Talk that featured sound and interspecies communication, and they're starting to think the public awareness and storytelling component of acoustics would make this rise in public consciousness enough to start to challenge the difficulty of enforcement.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, that's a funny thing about Fish Sounds Educate, right? Yeah, I recently reread that grant, and it's really neat to see how that happened, right? We put it forwards first. I was like, okay, we want to write a grant. Here's, the call. It's for ocean conservation. Got into the specifics of what the call was, and I said, look, like I think this aligns with their conservation target aims. Like public perception of these issues and awareness of these issues is a big part of this discussion. We wrote that down and they funded it, but I find the fact that like our initial estimate was like, oh, maybe we can reach 400 people and do 20 events in 2 years. And the reality is, 70 is a low end estimate. Like we present all the time. Many of the folks that are in this chat have been going into school groups, after school clubs, naturalist clubs. You've just been really great folks to work with. So yeah, I really do think that's how we can kind of move that topic forwards.
Yeah, and certainly a lot of fun opportunities for multimedia presentations when you're talking about acoustics. And some agreement in the chat as well. Okay, I'll do one last long pause in case there are any other questions or comments. Just some thank yous in the chat. So I think with that, we'll call it good. Thank you so much again, Kieran, for that wonderful presentation and for all of you attending. If you're interested in registering, we have 2 more seminars coming up, one in 2 weeks and one in 4 weeks. That'll cover international oh, thank you. Perfect. Yeah, international bioacoustics collaborations and then passive acoustic monitoring of fisheries. And you can find registration links at our Educate website. And then if you've missed any of our seminars and want to catch up, you can find them all at our YouTube channel, which I also just sent in the chat. So thank you all again, and hopefully see you in a couple of weeks.